Melissa sat quietly at her kitchen table, staring at the old photo album lying open in front of her. The house was silent, as it had been for years now. The ticking clock on the wall was the only sound that dared to fill the room. It had been 11 years, 11 long years, since her twin daughters vanished. After all that time, she had never once stopped hoping, never once stopped looking. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, she was afraid to turn the page. The photo was one she hadn't seen in years, taken on what should have been a perfect day, July 23, 1994, the twins' 7th birthday. The memory felt sharp and cruel now. The picture showed them smiling, standing proudly behind a picnic table covered in balloons and wrapped gifts. Their matching floral dresses swayed gently in the summer breeze as they leaned into each other. Melissa and her husband David stood on either side, each holding one small hand. Behind them, the green park stretched into trees, dappled with sunlight. It was the kind of day you take for granted, the kind of day that ends everything. Melissa's fingers trembled as she stared at the photo, but it wasn't the twins, the cake, or the balloons that caught her attention this time. It was something, someone, standing behind them. Farther back, near the trees, a man, barely noticeable, stood with his hands at his sides, staring directly at the camera, expressionless. Her throat tightened as a chill ran down her back. She couldn't believe she hadn't noticed him before. How had she missed it? Who was he? And why was he standing there, silently watching them on the day her daughters disappeared? She closed the album, unable to breathe for a moment. Then she reached for the phone. The call came early the next morning. Detective Karen Whitfield had been leading the investigation for years now. Cold cases rarely stayed warm this long, but this one had always haunted the department. 2 little girls gone from a public park in broad daylight, with dozens of people nearby, and not a single trace of where they went. Karen answered quickly when Melissa called. "I found something." Melissa's voice was shaking. "In one of the old photos, there's a man standing behind us. I don't recognize him." Karen drove over, and they sat together at the kitchen table. They spread the photo out carefully under a lamp. Karen stared at it for a long time. The man's face wasn't fully clear, but he was there, unmistakably there, standing off to the side, partially shadowed by the trees. His light jacket blended into the sunlit background, his stance casual but deliberate. "Why didn't this come up earlier?" Karen asked softly. "It was in my sister's personal album," Melissa whispered. "I don't know how I missed it." "I don't know," Karen nodded. "We've gone through every photo submitted back then. This one never came in." The investigation had been exhaustive, but now, 11 years later, this was the first real lead they had seen in a very long time. "We'll scan it," Karen said. "See if we can enhance the image." Melissa held the photo tightly before finally handing it over. "I know it's been so long," she whispered. "But maybe this will finally help." Karen placed a hand on hers. "We're going to follow this." The day the twins vanished had started perfectly. They had been so excited about their party at the park. The weather was perfect, warm but not too hot, with a light breeze swaying the balloons tied to the picnic table. Family and friends had gathered, laughter filling the air. Melissa could still hear their little voices singing as they blew out the candles. Emma and Lily had been inseparable. From birth, they moved through the world like 2 halves of the same heartbeat, their tiny arms always wrapped around each other, heads leaning together when they laughed, speaking in soft whispers only they seemed to understand. And then, within minutes, they were gone. Melissa had turned for just a moment to speak with her sister near the food table. When she turned back, the twins weren't there. She called their names calmly at first, thinking they had run to join the other children. But as minutes passed, her calls grew louder, more desperate. Guests fanned out across the park, searching. Parents called out while children stopped playing. David ran toward the nearby parking lot. Nothing. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. The police arrived quickly. The park was cordoned off, and an intense search began immediately. But there was nothing. No signs of struggle, no witnesses, no leads. Bloodhounds tracked their scent briefly, but lost it near the edge of the park's wooded area. Search helicopters circled for days. Nearby rivers, abandoned sheds, old wells, everything was checked. And yet, for 11 years, no trace of Emma and Lily was ever found. Until now. Karen sat in the dimly lit lab room at the police station as the technician enhanced the photo. Technology had come a long way since 1994. Small details began to emerge. The man's jawline, his short-cropped hair, the subtle pattern on his jacket. As the image sharpened, Karen leaned in. Run facial comparison through missing persons, criminal databases, and old interview lists, she instructed. The technician nodded, setting the system into motion. Hours passed. Finally, a small alert blinked on the screen. Potential partial match, Franklin Heller. Karen's stomach tightened. She pulled up the old file. Franklin Heller, investigated in 1993 for child endangerment charges involving a neighbor's daughter. Charges were dropped due to insufficient evidence. He relocated shortly afterward. Last known address listed from 1995. 2 towns over from where Emma and Lily disappeared. But there had been no activity on him since. No arrests, no employment records, no tax filings, almost as though he'd vanished too. Karen closed the file slowly, staring at his photo. If this was him, then after 11 years, they finally had a name tied to the twins' disappearance. For the first time since that awful day, the case was no longer cold. It was alive again. Karen stared at the file open before her as the faint hum of the old fluorescent lights filled the quiet office. The name on the screen, Franklin Heller, was the first real thread they'd touched in over a decade. It wasn't conclusive. It wasn't proof. But it was something. Melissa sat across from her, wringing her hands as Karen gently explained the findings. I want to be very honest, Karen said carefully. This isn't a full match, but it's strong enough that we need to follow it. Who is he? Melissa's voice cracked slightly. Karen slid the file across the table. In 1993, a year before your daughters disappeared, Hilaire was investigated for an incident involving a neighbor's child in another town. Nothing violent, at least nothing proven, but suspicious. He moved soon after the case was closed. Melissa's heart pounded. And now you think he might be connected to Emma and Lily? Karen sighed. I think it's possible. His face, his proximity at the time. It's enough for us to reopen the case fully. Melissa felt a strange swirl of emotions, relief that something was finally happening and terror at where this path might lead. For the first time in 11 years, a new team was assembled to revisit every piece of evidence. Karen pulled out the original witness statements from 1994. The day of the birthday party had been chaotic. So many people present, so many small details lost in the fear that followed. One detail stood out now, something that hadn't seemed significant at the time. A man, described vaguely as quiet, standing near the trees, had been noticed briefly by one of the other parents, but no one could identify him back then. The description loosely fit Heller's image. The problem was always the same. No one had seen him interact directly with the girls, but he had been there. Now Karen and her team began combing through every missing report, every traffic stop, every motel log within a 50-mile radius from that summer. Weeks passed. The trail was cold, but not dead. Then one small piece surfaced. An old rental log from a roadside storage facility, barely 15 miles from Millstone, was discovered during a sweep of public record archives. The storage unit had been registered in the summer of 1994 under the name Frank Hale. The manager at the time hadn't thought much of it. The unit was abandoned years later and auctioned off. No contents remained. No police had ever checked it in connection with the twins' disappearance. Hale wasn't an exact match, but close enough to warrant attention. Karen tracked down the old auction records, but found nothing conclusive. It was another frustrating dead end. But a pattern was emerging. Heller, or whoever he truly was, had been nearby. Meanwhile, Melissa continued to live through a strange kind of quiet agony. Each discovery brought her closer to a truth she both craved and feared. In her worst moments, she allowed herself to imagine what her daughters might look like now. Young women, teenagers, robbed of their childhood. Would she even recognize them today? David, her husband, handled his grief differently. He rarely spoke about the investigation anymore, afraid of getting his hopes up after years of disappointment. But this time felt different. Even David sat down quietly at the kitchen table when Karen visited again. We believe Heller, or Hale, or whatever name he's using, may have had access to storage properties in the area shortly after the twins disappeared, Karen explained. We're reviewing property transactions to see if any additional addresses connect to him. David spoke softly, his voice rough. After all these years, do you think they're still alive? Karen paused before answering. I can't answer that yet, but I do believe we're closer now than we've ever been. 2 weeks later, the team found their break. An abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of town had quietly changed ownership in 1994, transferred through a private cash sale. No mortgage, no bank involvement. The name on the deed was different, but the signature analysis suggested it may have been falsified. When Karen cross-referenced the address with DMV records, she found that a small utility van, registered under Franklin Howler's old name, had been seen parked near the property that same year, 1 month after the twins vanished. It had never been checked during the original search because the house was technically unoccupied and appeared deserted. Now, 11 years later, federal agents secured a search warrant. The team approached the property cautiously. The farmhouse was weathered and collapsing in places, with broken windows and a sagging roof. Weeds had swallowed the porch steps, and an old rusted swing hung crookedly from a nearby tree. Inside, layers of dust and mold made breathing difficult. Rodents and insects had claimed what was left. But hidden beneath the decay, investigators discovered subtle signs that someone had once prepared the house for occupancy. Old locks on interior doors, traces of child-sized bedding long since rotted away, faint marks on walls where furniture once stood. In a small back room, they found the most disturbing clue yet. Behind a false panel inside the closet, tucked between the wall beams, was a box wrapped in plastic. Inside were children's items. 2 matching headbands, still faintly floral despite the decay. A small stuffed animal Melissa instantly recognized from old photos, and a photograph, badly damaged, of the twins standing beside the same birthday table from that afternoon. This wasn't coincidence. This was possession. This man, whoever he truly was, had taken something from that day and kept it. Karen met with Melissa and David in person to share the discovery. Melissa's hands trembled as she held the photograph. The pain in her chest tightened like a fist. "This was theirs," she whispered. "That's Emma's bear, and Lily's headband." David stared, unable to speak, his face pale and still. Karen spoke softly. "This confirms Heller had them. He was there. We believe he brought them here after the abduction." Melissa's eyes filled. "But after that, what happened to them?" Karen shook her head gently. "We're still searching, but we're closer." The media got wind of the discovery within days. Reporters gathered outside the farmhouse as crime scene tape fluttered in the wind. The story of the missing twins had haunted the town for years, but now it had become national again. Karen received calls from other jurisdictions. Old reports were reopened, and investigators from neighboring states offered to share files. A profile was emerging. Franklin Heller, if that was his real name, wasn't simply a man who had taken Emma and Lily. He may have done this before, and possibly after. The next few weeks moved differently now. For the first time since that afternoon in 1994, Melissa and David found themselves fielding phone calls not from sympathetic friends or therapists, but from detectives, prosecutors, and federal agents. After 11 years of silence, the investigation wasn't crawling anymore. It was running. Karen Whitfield worked late into most nights, re-reviewing everything from the original case file, cross-referencing each new lead with jurisdictions far beyond. Millstone. Franklin Heller had vanished from public records, but patterns had started to emerge. Old missing child reports, mostly overlooked back then, were revisited. A few involved brief disappearances that ended with children being found unharmed, but with unsettling similarities. Remote public parks, unmonitored locations, parents distracted for just a moment. But none were as permanent or as tragic as Emma and Lily's case. And one thing became clear. Heller didn't just happen upon Melissa's twins that day. He had likely been watching for some time. Karen quietly scheduled a meeting with Melissa, alone, sensing that some conversations would be too heavy with David present. The two sat in Karen's office late one afternoon as the sun dipped behind the trees. "Melissa," Karen began softly, "I need to ask you some difficult questions. I want you to think carefully." Melissa nodded, hands folded tightly in her lap. "In the weeks leading up to the girl's birthday, did you ever notice anyone unusual? Anyone lingering near your house, around the school, or even at church?" Melissa's eyes narrowed slightly, sifting back through old memories. "There was a man," she whispered, her voice catching. Karen sat forward. "When was this?" "Maybe 2 weeks before the party. I saw him across the street when I was getting the girls from school. He wasn't near any other children. He was just standing there, near the parking lot, watching." "Did you report it?" Melissa shook her head slowly. "At the time, I don't know what I thought. That maybe I was overreacting." Karen nodded gently. "You weren't." Melissa's throat tightened. "It was him, wasn't it?" "We believe it likely was." As Karen expanded the investigation, she requested assistance from retired Detective Russ Carlson, who had led part of the original search in 1994 before transferring out of state. Russ sat down with Karen and reviewed the new findings. "This man was careful," Russ said, tapping the old file. "He wasn't someone who panicked. He planned. He staged." Karen nodded. "He blended in at the park that day. No one noticed him except for that distant figure caught in the photo." Russ leaned back. He likely had studied the family long before that birthday party. Karen exhaled. "He selected them." Meanwhile, the forensic team working the farmhouse made another discovery. Beneath a loose floorboard in the rear bedroom, they found several old Polaroid photos, badly damaged, most too deteriorated to identify. But one was salvageable enough to be horrifying. It showed the inside of that same farmhouse. 2 small beds, child-sized pajamas folded neatly on top, and 2 young girls, faces blurred with age but clearly twins, sitting quietly on the floor, holding stuffed animals. It was the first visual confirmation that Emma and Lily had been held inside that house after their disappearance. Melissa and David were shown the photo carefully, with victim advocates present. Melissa's breath left her body as tears filled her eyes. "That's Lily's bear," she whispered, voice shaking. David sat frozen, staring in absolute silence. For years they had lived between hope and fear, praying their daughters might still be alive somewhere. Now, for the first time, it was confirmed they had survived the abduction, at least for a time. Karen pressed forward harder than ever. "Now we have 2 time frames to focus on," she told her team. "The initial abduction and the period following. We know he kept them alive, at least briefly, inside that farmhouse. But beyond that, the trail remained thin. If Heller had moved them afterward, no one knew where. As news broke of the Polaroids, tips began flooding in from the public. Several old neighbors from Heller's former residence called in. One woman, living 3 blocks from his old address, recalled seeing him at a nearby hardware store multiple times in 1994, sometimes with what she now thought may have been 1 or 2 young girls waiting in his vehicle. "I just assumed they were his kids," the woman admitted. Another tipster, a retired gas station clerk, remembered Heller paying cash for fuel late at night, always driving an older beige van with no license plates visible. The van was never found. As these fragments trickled in, Karen turned her attention to financial traces. While Heller hadn't used banks or credit cards under his real name since 1994, investigators located small cash purchase records for camping equipment, propane tanks, and food supplies during the following year. He was living off-grid, Karen muttered to herself while reviewing the files. Completely off-grid. A profile began forming. Isolated, mobile, calculated, patient, but also unstable, and perhaps most terrifyingly, adaptable. The next lead came from a place no one expected. In neighboring Westbrook County, nearly 70 miles away, an old abandoned hunting cabin was recently seized by the county for unpaid taxes. When investigators cross-checked ownership history, they found the cabin was quietly purchased under another alias tied to Heller, Frederick Hale, registered only months after the twins vanished. No one had ever connected the property before. The federal team moved in carefully. Inside the cabin, much was long abandoned and stripped by time. But tucked beneath the old wooden floorboards, wrapped in plastic, was another small collection of children's items. A faded pink sweatshirt embroidered with Lily, a small charm bracelet Melissa had once given Emma for her 7th birthday, and horrifyingly, 2 locks of carefully tied identical blonde hair. The cabin was now an active crime scene. Karen met with Melissa and David that evening, her voice steady but gentle. "We've confirmed this property was used by Heller." Melissa's lips trembled. Were they alive there?" Karen hesitated. "We believe he kept them there after leaving the farmhouse. How long they remained alive, we're still working to establish." Melissa covered her mouth, tears spilling freely. David's voice broke for the first time in months. "We were so close and never knew." Karen placed her hand over Melissa's. "I promise you, we will find out the full truth. And somewhere out there, after all these years, Franklin Heller, or whatever name he was using now, was still hiding. But not for much longer." The morning after the cabin discovery, the mood inside the sheriff's office was different. Every investigator in the room knew they were no longer working a simple cold case. This had shifted into something far larger and far darker. Karen stood at the center of a large conference room. Maps were pinned to the walls, photographs spread across tables, timelines laid out like puzzle pieces. Franklin Heller hadn't just abducted the twins. He'd moved them, hidden them, and for years, he'd lived like a man who knew exactly how to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. But no one outruns time forever. As federal agents expanded their search radius, they discovered Heller's trail extending across multiple counties over the span of several years. He had lived under multiple aliases, rented storage units under different names, and used cash-only transactions for almost everything. His old beige van, which had long been missing, had finally been located deep in a remote junkyard outside state lines. It had been stripped down, its serial numbers filed off, but a forensic team recovered enough to confirm it was once registered to one of Heller's false identities. Inside, beneath an old flooring panel of the vehicle, they discovered more personal items. Tiny plastic hair clips matching those the twins had worn, a single crayon drawing, faded, childlike, showing 2 girls holding hands next to a cabin, a tall man drawn beside them. Melissa was shown the drawing under careful supervision. Her hands shook violently. "That's Emma's," she whispered, tears already streaming. "She always drew the little hearts above their heads like that." It was undeniable. The twins had been alive long enough to leave traces of themselves inside Heller's hidden world. As each new piece surfaced, Karen found herself haunted by the same question. Why hadn't he killed them right away? This wasn't the pattern most child abductors followed. Heller hadn't acted impulsively. His movements showed planning, patience, even care in a way that made the horror somehow worse. He had kept them. For how long? No one yet knew. During a deep background dive, one of the federal analysts discovered a thin but critical thread. Before adopting the name Frank Hale, Heller had once briefly worked as a groundskeeper at a remote church camp in the early 1990s, Camp Alderbrook, located deep in the forests 2 states over. The camp had long since closed, abandoned after a financial collapse. Records indicated Heller was dismissed quietly for violating camp policies, though no formal charges were filed. No one had ever connected his history there to the disappearance of Emma and Lily. But Karen saw it differently. She marked the location on the growing map. This was his practice ground, she said softly. He learned how to move children without drawing attention. The team secured a search warrant for the old camp property. By the time agents arrived, nature had reclaimed most of it. Buildings had collapsed, paths were overgrown, and wildlife roamed freely where children had once played. But inside one of the surviving cabins, agents found more remnants of Heller's past. Among broken bunks and rotted beams was a hidden compartment. Beneath the cabin floorboards was a small, decayed suitcase. Inside were girls' clothing, sizes consistent with Emma and Lily, old Polaroids showing wooded areas, possibly earlier, scouting locations, and a single audio cassette labeled only with the number 7. The tape was carefully restored by audio technicians. When played, it revealed short recordings, childish laughter, soft humming, a girl speaking faintly in the background. Melissa and David were not present when the tape was reviewed. It was simply too much. Karen listened with a heavy heart. The voices were unmistakably those of Emma and Lily. They were alive, talking, laughing, at least for some time after their abduction. But the recordings also offered a glimpse into something more chilling. A man's voice occasionally entered the tape, softly instructing the girls to say certain phrases or counting with them, like a twisted version of playtime drills. There was no fear in their voices, not yet, which suggested something Karen couldn't ignore. They had trusted, him at least, early on. Back at headquarters, Karen sat quietly with Melissa and David to gently share the next steps. "We're building a strong timeline now," Karen explained. "We know he kept them for months, maybe longer. We have evidence he moved them between properties." Melissa barely whispered. "And then?" Karen hesitated. "We don't know what happened after, but we are closing in." David's voice was rough. "Do you think they're still alive?" The question hung heavy in the air. Karen chose her words carefully. "I believe this man kept them alive longer than anyone thought. Whether they survived past that point, we're still fighting to answer that." Melissa closed her eyes, clutching David's hand. Meanwhile, the manhunt for Heller expanded nationally. With each new property discovery, each recovered item, his profile sharpened. He was organized, intelligent, disconnected from normal human attachments. But more disturbingly, he had been able to evade detection for over a decade. Karen often stared at the map in her office late at night, wondering, was he still out there, watching, waiting, or had he disappeared for good? What the investigators didn't yet know, and what they would only begin to discover in the next phase, was that Heller hadn't vanished completely. In fact, he had been living quietly, less than 200 miles away, under a name no one yet knew, in a community no one suspected, carrying the final pieces of the puzzle that had haunted Melissa and David for over 11 years. The deeper they dug into Heller's life, the more unsettling it became. His trail wasn't random. It was careful, clean, almost surgical. Karen and her team began reconstructing his entire life backward, name by name, property by property, year by year. Heller had used at least 4 different aliases across 3 states. Each time he moved, he stayed just long enough to disappear again before anyone asked too many questions. And in every location, small patterns kept repeating: isolated rental, cabins, remote storage units, cash-only transactions, no stable job history. It was as though he had practiced vanishing long before taking Emma and Lily. Melissa sat through every update, but each new piece of information left her further trapped between hope and terror. The more they learned, the more the timeline stretched. Her daughters hadn't just vanished that afternoon. They had survived, at least for some time. And yet no one could say for how long. No one could answer the one question that mattered most. One morning, Karen called Melissa and David into the station. She had something new, something different. "This came through an old database cross-check last night," Karen began, her tone careful. She laid a weathered missing persons flyer on the table. The date read May 1990, 4 years before Emma and Lily vanished. The photo was of another set of twin girls, this time from a small town nearly 400 miles away. Their names were Rachel and Sophie Hartman, both 5 years old when they disappeared. Their case had gone cold, just like Melissa's had. No suspects, no leads. But now, after running property sales tied to Heller's earliest aliases, Karen discovered that he had lived briefly within 30 miles of the Hartman twins at the time of their disappearance. Melissa stared at the flyer, her breath catching. "You think he—" Karen nodded slowly. "We believe Emma and Lily may not have been his first." Suddenly the investigation wasn't just about one crime. It was about a pattern, a horrifying pattern, and possibly others like Emma and Lily who were never found. The federal task force assigned additional analysts to comb through old, unsolved child abduction files spanning the last 15 years. With every match to Heller's known locations, the list grew longer. In total, 5 missing children cases surfaced, each in areas where Heller had lived under different names. All girls, all between the ages of 5 and 9. But Emma and Lily's case was still different because this time, physical evidence had been found. With mounting pressure, the FBI formally elevated the case to a full federal manhunt. Agents released Heller's photo, age progressed, to news outlets across multiple states. Tips poured in, but most led nowhere. False sightings, dead ends, and yet they kept looking. Then came the most promising lead yet. A woman in a rural town just 2 counties away called the tip line. She managed a small roadside diner and believed one of her regular customers fit the composite sketch that had aired recently. "He comes in every week," she told agents. "Sits alone, always orders the same thing, real quiet, real polite, pays cash, never talks much." Security footage showed a man, slightly older with graying hair, wearing a ball cap pulled low, but the facial structure was similar. His behavior fit Heller's known patterns. Agents moved in carefully. By the following morning, surveillance confirmed it. The man visiting the diner was using a new alias, Daniel Ellis, another identity completely fabricated. He had rented a small trailer outside town, living under the radar. The team prepared for an immediate operation. Karen stood quietly outside the trailer as agents surrounded the perimeter. Her heart pounded as they gave the order. "FBI, open the door." No response. After 3 warnings, the door was breached. Inside, the trailer was sparse, clean, organized, but eerily silent. There was no sign of anyone inside. The bed was made, clothes were neatly folded, dishes cleaned. And on the small table sat something chilling. A single framed photo of 2 small girls, blonde, smiling, wearing matching dresses. It was Emma and Lily, the very same photo from the birthday party. Karen felt her breath catch. He had kept their image with him. Forensic teams swept through the trailer. There were journals, pages filled with obsessive writings. He wrote about the twins, about how they belonged to him now, about how the real world didn't deserve them, about protecting them from harm. It was the first real insight into his mind and his delusion. But still, no mention of what he had ultimately done to them. The search expanded to the surrounding area. A heavily wooded property behind the trailer was flagged for a deeper search. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Melissa was notified but not brought to the site. She waited in agonizing silence as the search continued for days. Finally, something was found. A small underground root cellar, long sealed, hidden beneath a collapsed shed. Inside, they discovered traces of fabric and personal belongings, but still no bodies. Forensic experts confirmed that some of the material matched Emma and Lily's DNA. The twins had been there, but once again, only for a time. Karen sat quietly across from Melissa that evening, her voice soft. We've confirmed they were alive much longer than anyone believed. Melissa's hands trembled. But not now? Karen could barely whisper. We still don't know. David sat frozen, staring at the floor. And somewhere out there, Heller was still one step ahead, but his world was shrinking. As the weeks passed, the investigation shifted into a more psychological phase. For the first time, they weren't just chasing Heller's movements. They were studying his mind. Karen sat across from Special Agent Lauren Rhee, a federal behavioral analyst brought in to profile Heller's patterns. Lauren had spent years studying long-term child abduction offenders. But even she admitted this one felt different. Heller wasn't impulsive, Lauren explained, pointing to the maps and case files spread across the table. He's methodical, careful. He doesn't simply snatch and run. He studies, plans, inserts himself into his victims' worlds long before the abduction. Karen nodded. We suspected he was watching Melissa's family for weeks. Lauren leaned forward. Possibly months. The profile painted an unsettling picture. Heller likely saw Emma and Lily not as victims, but as something far worse, as replacements for something he had lost or never had. His journals hinted at a fantasy where he rescued the girls from what he viewed as a broken world. This wasn't about ransom, Lauren continued, and it wasn't purely about control. In his mind, he created an artificial family. But why twins? Karen asked quietly. Lauren paused. For someone like him, twins feed a deeper fantasy. Balance, symmetry, control. If he was replacing something missing in his own life, two identical children allowed him to live inside that fantasy fully. But with all their psychological insights, they were still no closer to physically locating him. That changed when Karen received a call from an unexpected place. A retired social worker named Margaret Donnelly, from a foster licensing agency, reached out after seeing Heller's sketch on the news. I believe I met him years ago, she told investigators. Back in 1998, 4 years after Emma and Lily's disappearance, a man calling himself Stephen Harper applied to be a foster parent. Through a private agency in a neighboring state, he was denied after failing background checks, not because of criminal records. He didn't have any under that name. But something about him felt rehearsed, too perfect, Margaret explained. His answers felt memorized. At the time, no one linked him to any ongoing missing child investigations. The application records were still stored. The photo attached to the file was unmistakably Heller, using yet another name. It confirmed something terrifying. For at least part of that period, he wasn't fully isolated. He had tried to present himself as someone who could legally care for children, as if seeking legitimacy for what he had already done in secret. Digging into that lead, Karen's team found something they hadn't seen before. Under the name Stephen Harper, Heller had rented a suburban home for nearly 2 years, between 1997 and 1999. Until now, no one knew he had lived in a populated neighborhood. The house, now occupied by new tenants, was located in a quiet cul-de-sac, with families all around, yards filled with swing sets, basketball hoops, and children playing. He had blended in perfectly. Investigators moved in carefully. With permission from the current owners, forensic teams examined the house. Inside a sealed crawl space beneath the floorboards, they discovered a small, forgotten storage bin. Inside were several disturbing artifacts, children's drawings, clearly from 2 different hands, a faded paper chain marked with the words, "Happy 9th birthday," and 2 small necklaces, one with the letter E and one with the letter L. The drawings were chilling. One showed 2 girls inside a simple house, smiling, with a man standing behind them. Another showed only one girl standing alone, while the other lay flat on a small bed. It was the first direct hint that something may have happened to one of the twins before the other. Melissa and David were brought in for a controlled viewing of the evidence. David clenched his fists as he stared at the necklaces. Melissa's voice cracked as she whispered, "That's Emma's charm. Lily's too." Karen gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "This confirms that they were alive here, at least for some time." The paper chain suggested the twins had reached at least age 9, which meant they had been alive for nearly 2 full years after their abduction. The neighbors were interviewed. Most had no memory of anyone suspicious from nearly a decade ago. One neighbor vaguely recalled a man who homeschooled his nieces, but at the time no one thought much of it. Healer had kept them fully hidden in plain sight. No school records, no medical records, no public interactions. He created an artificial world within the walls of that suburban home, and for 2 years, no one had known. Karen sat silently with Lauren that night. "He's more adaptable than we thought," Karen whispered. Lauren nodded grimly. "He wasn't just a drifter. He learned how to mimic normal life when he needed to." Karen stared at the growing evidence wall, every part of her refusing to say what her mind already feared, that at some point, for some reason, Healer's fantasy had begun to fracture. And that fracture might explain why Emma and Lily were no longer with him. But the full truth still remained locked in the missing pieces, and Heller himself was still out there, watching, waiting. For days, Karen sat in her office, staring at the growing evidence board. The case had now stretched across over a decade of Heller's life. And yet, despite all they had found, there was still a gap, a silence. Roughly 2 years after Emma and Lily were confirmed alive in that suburban house, Heller vanished once again. No property records, no financial activity, no neighbors who remembered him moving out. It was as if one day he simply disappeared again and took the girls with him. But Karen was starting to see something in the timeline that no one had noticed before. Heller didn't just disappear at random. He vanished shortly after the state conducted a routine audit of foster care applications, the same system where he had once tried to register under his fake identity as Stephen Harper. "They almost caught his paperwork," Karen said during a task force briefing. Lauren, the behavioral profiler, nodded. "He likely feared exposure and went underground again." "But where did he go?" one agent asked. Karen leaned over the maps. "He didn't run far. He adapted again." The team started re-examining the years following his disappearance from that neighborhood, focusing not on criminal databases, but on low-visibility employment records, cash businesses where background checks were minimal. That's when they found it. A private maintenance contractor working for an aging independent motel chain located nearly 200 miles north hired a man in 2001 under yet another name, Gerald Morris. The address listed on his employment file was a P.O. box. No tax filings, no bank deposits, all payments made through cashier's checks. The owner of the motel, an elderly man named Warren Clark, was still alive. Karen and her team visited him personally. Warren met them in the dusty office of one of his remaining motel properties. He shuffled through old ledgers as Karen gently asked her questions. "Yeah, I remember him," Warren said, squinting at the faded employee paperwork. "Quiet fella, hard worker, didn't talk much." "Did he ever mention having a family?" Karen asked. Warren scratched his head. Once or twice he talked about his nieces, said their parents had passed. He homeschooled them. Karen felt the cold rise in her stomach. "Did you ever meet the girls?" "No, ma'am. Said he kept them home most of the time." Karen leaned in. "Where did he live while working for you?" Warren pointed out the window. "He stayed back behind the property line in one of those old mobile homes. Wasn't much to it. The mobile home had been long abandoned after Heller, under his fake name, suddenly left the job. Forensic teams moved in. The trailer was stripped bare, but signs remained. Old school books, a twin-sized mattress, a cracked photo frame missing its picture. In a corner cabinet, behind loose paneling, they discovered something chilling. 2 small pairs of worn shoes, both pairs still neatly placed side by side. Karen sat across from Melissa and David days later. Her voice was steady, but the weight of her words hung heavy. This confirms they were alive even later than we first believed. Melissa's hands trembled. They were still together? Karen nodded softly. We believe so. And at this point, Emma and Lily would have been at least 11 years old. David quietly rubbed his face, unable to look up. But even now, the most important question remained unanswered. What happened next? As the investigation turned toward the final missing years, Lauren's behavioral profile took a darker turn. His psychological need for control was always escalating, she explained. But these long-term abductions rarely stay stable forever. Karen listened carefully. The older the girls became, Lauren continued, the harder it would have been for him to maintain full dominance. Twins support each other emotionally, which means they may have started resisting, even subtly. And for someone like Heller, resistance is destabilizing. Karen swallowed. And destabilization often leads to escalation. Lauren nodded. Or termination. Then, for the first time in years, they got something completely unexpected, a live sighting. A gas station attendant working the night shift outside a rural town called in a tip after seeing one of the recent age-progressed sketches broadcast on the national news. He was here, the attendant said firmly. I swear to you. The man had come in late at night, paid cash, kept his head down. The attendant remembered him because the man had asked for directions to an old forest road, one that led deep into uninhabited state parkland. He seemed calm, the attendant said. Polite, but odd. Surveillance footage confirmed the man resembled Heller. And just like that, after years of dead ends, the manhunt shifted again, this time toward the dense woods of Miller Ridge Reserve. Karen, along with federal search teams, moved in. This wasn't a public park. It was thousands of acres of protected forest, rarely used, with no permanent campsites, only rough logging trails and abandoned hunting cabins. Multiple search grids were deployed. K-9 units combed the woods. Aerial drones scanned for fresh structures. And then they found something. Buried deep within a small clearing, several miles from the nearest road, searchers discovered a heavily camouflaged underground shelter. It was crude, but extremely well constructed, hidden beneath layers of brush and covered by carefully placed logs. Inside, they found what looked like the final hideout Heller may have used. There were no bodies, but there were unmistakable signs of recent occupation. Stockpiled canned food, clothing items consistent with small female sizes, handwritten journals partially burned but salvageable, a metal lockbox containing several old Polaroids too degraded to identify faces clearly. But most disturbing of all, behind a sealed compartment, they discovered a pair of identical handmade cloth dolls, both dressed like twins, both carefully preserved, both showing visible signs of years of handling. Karen stood inside the shelter, the air heavy with mold and silence. She whispered to herself, almost unable to breathe. They were here. And somewhere nearby, perhaps even watching, Hilaire remained free, for now. The discovery of the hidden underground shelter shook everyone on the task force. But it was the journals, partially burned but still recoverable, that would finally reveal something far more terrifying than anyone expected. The handwriting was unmistakably Heller's. The entries started like warped diary pages, calm at first, disturbingly organized. They're adjusting well. They listen. They obey. I teach them everything. They don't need anyone else. This is their new family. I'm their protector now. Melissa sat in Karen's office when the first few pages were read aloud to her. Her hands trembled, but her voice remained steady, her mother's instinct cutting through the horror. "He was brainwashing them," she whispered. Karen nodded. "He convinced them this was normal, that you never existed." David sat frozen beside her, jaw clenched. The entries continued. "Emma still cries some nights. She remembers, but Lily has adjusted better. Twins are different. One always leads. One always follows. I separate them when necessary. They learn faster when apart." Melissa's chest tightened as she gasped softly. "He separated them." Karen nodded slowly. For any parent, especially a mother, that detail was shattering. The idea that your children, inseparable from birth, had been deliberately pulled apart as part of his control. Melissa's tears fell freely now. That would have broken them. David's voice cracked. That man didn't just kidnap them, he rewired who they were. But what came next was worse. One entry, dated approximately 2 years after the abduction. "The older one is resisting. She talks back. She questions. I cannot allow division. If one refuses the structure, both will fail." Melissa's breath froze in her throat. Karen whispered gently, "We believe Emma may have started pushing back while Lily stayed compliant. The horror wasn't just the abduction anymore. It was knowing that even years after that birthday party, one of her daughters was still fighting, still trying to find a way back, while the other may have been too young to fully grasp the wrongness of what was happening. The emotional divide between her girls was being weaponized. Lauren, the profiler, explained quietly, "For long-term abductors like Heller, once one child resists, it breaks the entire psychological system he built. His control begins to crumble." "Melissa," whispered, "And that's when things changed?" Karen nodded. "Likely, yes." He dropped her off anonymously at a remote hospital nearly 300 miles away, giving false information that she had been abandoned. "She was alive when I left her," he whispered. "That was years ago." That revelation reignited the search. Within 72 hours, agents traced back the anonymous hospital intake forms from nearly 8 years prior. A girl had been admitted under the name Anna, estimated age 12, showing clear signs of long-term psychological trauma and memory suppression. No family had ever come forward to claim her. She had spent the last several years inside a state-run psychiatric care facility. Karen and her team moved quickly. Melissa and David were brought to the facility, and there, sitting quietly in a small recreation room, drawing with crayons, was their daughter Lily. It took months of therapy, counseling, and carefully reintroduced memories. But slowly, pieces of her real identity began returning. At first, small flashes, a birthday, cake, a picnic table, balloons, her sister's voice, and finally, her parents' faces. Melissa wept for days. David could barely speak, simply holding his daughter's hand in silence. They had lost one child, but after 12 years of hell, they had found the other alive. Heller was sentenced to life without parole. The town that once whispered about the twins' disappearance now stood silent, humbled by the cruelty of what had unfolded and the strength of the family who never stopped searching. And even after all those years, that one birthday photo with the strange man standing quietly in the background still sat framed in Karen's office, the photo that had changed everything. 6 months later, the courtroom stood silent as Franklin Heller was sentenced. Life without parole. Melissa and David sat quietly in the back row, not because they wanted justice, but because they needed to witness the end. The man who had stolen everything from them would spend the rest of his life behind concrete walls. But even that didn't feel like closure because the real work was only beginning. Lily's recovery was slow, fragile, but steady. The psychiatric team worked carefully, layer by layer, guiding her through memories both painful and beautiful. At first, She spoke only in short sentences. She still called Melissa the nice lady for weeks, unable to fully connect the faces to the life she barely remembered. But then one afternoon, sitting in the hospital garden, Lily softly whispered, "You used to braid my hair like this." Melissa froze, her hands trembling. "Yes, baby," she whispered through tears. "I did." It was the first moment Melissa saw her daughter fully return. In the months that followed, Lily moved back home under strict medical supervision. David remodeled her old bedroom, careful not to overwhelm her. He kept familiar objects nearby, stuffed, animals, books, photos, anything that might gently reconnect her to the world she lost. The community, once consumed by rumors, now wrapped around the family with quiet support. Neighbors brought meals. Old friends came by softly, offering nothing but warmth. Lily rarely spoke about Emma. When she did, it was only in simple, broken fragments. She used to hum me to sleep when I was scared. Melissa always listened. She never pushed, because some wounds don't heal fully. They simply learn to live alongside the love that remains. As autumn arrived, Melissa stood quietly by Emma's grave for the first time since her remains were laid to rest. The headstone was simple. Emma Monroe, always brave, always loved. Melissa placed a small pink ribbon on the headstone, the same color her daughters had worn on their 7th birthday. The wind was soft, the air peaceful, and for the first time in 12 years, she allowed herself to breathe. The photo that had started it all, that frozen frame from 1994, still sat on Karen's desk, a reminder that sometimes one small, overlooked detail can unravel the darkest secrets. And sometimes, even after unimaginable loss, a single thread of hope survives.